January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest. Snow falls in thick curtains over the shattered remains of what was once a Wehrmacht supply depot. The air smells of pine sap, cordite, and something else, something unfamiliar to the German soldiers huddled in their foxholes. It is the smell of frying meat, carried on the wind from American positions less than a kilometer away. In the gray dawn light, Oberstleutnant Klaus Hartmann presses his face against the frozen earth, his stomach contracting with a hunger so profound it has become a constant companion. He has not eaten meat in 6 weeks. His rations consist of black bread that crumbles like ash, ersatz coffee made from acorns, and occasionally a thin soup with floating bits of turnip. But now, as he lies in the snow, he smells bacon. Real bacon. And eggs. And coffee that actually smells like coffee. This is not what he was promised. The story of how German and Japanese soldiers confronted American material abundance during World War II is not merely a footnote about logistics or supply chains. It is a story about the collision of ideologies made manifest in the most basic human need: food. It is about young men raised on propaganda that promised them superiority, discovering that their enemy ate like kings while they starved like beggars. It is about the moment when the machinery of fascist rhetoric ground against the hard reality of democratic industrial might, and broke. To understand this moment, this profound shock that rippled through Axis forces as they encountered American soldiers, we must first understand what these men had been told, what they believed, and what they expected to find when they met the Americans in combat. Sound of marching feet. Distant drums. In 1941, when Klaus Hartmann was 17 years old, he stood in a recruitment hall in Munich and listened to a Wehrmacht officer describe the American soldier. The officer was precise, methodical, convincing. The American fighting man, he explained, was soft. He was the product of a decadent society that valued comfort over sacrifice, individualism over duty. He came from a mongrel nation with no true culture, no martial tradition, no stomach for real war. The Americans had stumbled into the First World War late, the officer said, and only prevailed because European powers had already bled themselves white. They were shopkeepers and factory workers playing at soldier. They would break easily. Klaus believed this because he had been given every reason to believe it. The Third Reich's propaganda machine had spent years constructing an image of American weakness. Films showed American cities as places of crime and degeneracy. Radio broadcasts mocked American jazz music as primitive noise, American democracy as chaotic and inefficient. The Führer himself had dismissed the United States as a Jewish-ruled nation incapable of mounting serious military opposition. And there was some historical precedent for doubt. America's army in 1939 ranked 18th in the world, behind Romania. Its soldiers trained with wooden rifles and trucks marked with tank signs because they possessed so few actual weapons. But what the propaganda never mentioned, what the officers never explained, was what happened when that sleeping industrial giant woke up. By 1942, American factories were producing war materials at a rate that defied comprehension. Every 24 hours, American shipyards launched 3 new vessels. Every 60 seconds, an American factory completed another Jeep. The United States manufactured more ammunition in 1 year than Germany produced during the entire war. But the true measure of American abundance was not found in tanks or ships or planes. It was found in something far more basic, far more psychologically devastating to an enemy soldier: food. The standard daily ration for an American soldier contained approximately 4,000 calories. It included fresh or canned meat at every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Bacon and eggs in the morning. Beef stew or pork chops at midday. Roast turkey or ham for dinner. There were canned fruits, vegetables in variety, real butter, actual coffee, sugar, chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum. The K ration alone, the emergency field ration designed for when hot meals were impossible, contained cheese, crackers, dried fruit, candy, and 4 cigarettes. American soldiers complained about this food. They called it monotonous. They grumbled that the turkey at Thanksgiving wasn't as good as mother made. They had no idea that their enemy would have considered their worst meal a feast beyond imagination. The German ration told a different story. In 1941, the standard Wehrmacht ration provided approximately 3,000 calories. Adequate, though not generous. It included meat, though usually in preserved form, and real coffee, though in limited quantities. But as the war ground on, as supply lines stretched across vast Russian steppes and North African deserts, as Allied bombing destroyed German infrastructure and blockade strangled imports, the rations diminished. By 1943, meat appeared perhaps once a week. By 1944, the daily bread ration had been cut to 300 grams, barely enough to sustain a man at rest, let alone one fighting for his life. Coffee became a memory, replaced by roasted grain substitutes. Butter vanished entirely, replaced by industrial fats that tasted of chemicals and left men with diarrhea. Wehrmacht documents from 1944 reveal a catastrophic breakdown in supply. One report from Army Group Center noted that soldiers were subsisting on 1,500 calories per day, half what was needed for men in combat. They were eating their horses. They were boiling leather boots to make soup. They were suffering from night blindness caused by vitamin A deficiency, losing teeth from scurvy, collapsing from malnutrition-induced heart failure. This was the reality that Klaus Hartmann and millions of others carried with them into battle. This was the gnawing, constant hunger that made their hands shake and their minds fog and their bodies fail at the worst possible moments. And then they met the Americans. Sound of artillery, distant and rhythmic. The first encounters came in North Africa, late 1942. German Afrika Korps veterans, lean and weathered from 2 years of desert warfare, overran American positions at Kasserine Pass and discovered something that stopped them in their tracks: American supply dumps. Mountains of supplies. Warehouses full of equipment still in factory crates. And food. Unimaginable quantities of food. Lieutenant Heinz Werner Schmidt, a German officer who fought in North Africa, later wrote in his memoir, "We captured an American supply depot and could not believe our eyes. There were pallets of canned goods stacked to the ceiling, meat, fruit, vegetables, even ice cream mix. There were cartons of cigarettes, real coffee, chocolate bars. My men fell on it like starving wolves. Many ate until they were sick. We had been surviving on stale bread and thin soup for months. The Americans had been eating like this every day. In that moment, I understood that we could not win this war. You cannot defeat an enemy who can afford to feed his soldiers ice cream in the middle of a desert." Ice cream. In the Sahara Desert. The symbolism was almost too perfect to be believed, yet it was absolutely true. The United States military produced portable ice cream machines that could be set up in field conditions. Aircraft carriers had ice cream parlors. There was even an official position: ice cream maker, third class. American commanders understood that morale mattered, that small luxuries made hard conditions bearable, and that a nation with the industrial capacity to manufacture floating ice cream barges while simultaneously building the world's largest fleet was sending a message that transcended mere logistics. The message was simple: we have so much that we can waste it. We are so powerful that we can afford frivolity. You are hungry and we are eating dessert in a war zone. For German soldiers, this discovery was profoundly disorienting. Fritz Fürst, a German infantryman captured in Tunisia, was interviewed by Allied intelligence officers in 1943. The transcript records his words: "We were told the Americans were weak and unprepared. We were told their economy was failing, that their people were divided and demoralized. Then we captured their supplies and found they had 3 types of meat for one meal. 3 types. In one meal. We were eating sawdust bread and they had 3 different meats. Either our leaders had lied to us, or they had no idea what they were talking about. Either way, we could not win." Sound of ocean waves. Jungle birds. Half a world away, Japanese soldiers were experiencing their own devastating encounter with American abundance. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its entire military philosophy around concepts of spiritual superiority and warrior asceticism. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship, to find strength in suffering, to view physical deprivation as a path to martial excellence. They were taught that 1 rice ball per day was sufficient, that hunger sharpened the spirit, that American softness and love of comfort made Americans inferior warriors. This ideology collided with reality in the jungles of Guadalcanal. August 1942. The Solomon Islands. Japanese forces, accustomed to quick victories and brief campaigns, found themselves locked in a grinding 6-month battle against American Marines who would not break. The Japanese supply line, stretched across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean and increasingly threatened by American submarines and aircraft, began to fail. Rice shipments stopped arriving. Medical supplies ran out. Japanese soldiers, already lean from Spartan rations, began to starve in earnest. And then they encountered American positions. Sergeant Yukio Matsumoto, captured on Guadalcanal in November 1942, provided testimony to American intelligence that was later declassified. He described creeping toward American lines at night, hoping to gather intelligence. Instead, he smelled food cooking. Real food. Meat and onions and coffee and bread. He watched through binoculars as American soldiers sat around field kitchens, eating from metal trays loaded with portions that would have fed his entire squad. He saw them light cigarettes and throw away half-smoked butts. He saw them dump leftover food into waste pits, food that his starving comrades would have fought over. I could not reconcile what I was seeing with what we had been taught, Matsumoto said through an interpreter. We were told Americans were weak, that they could not endure hardship. But they did not have to endure hardship. They brought their entire nation with them. They brought factories and farms and electricity. We brought rice and bullets, and when those ran out, we brought nothing. They ate meat 3 times a day while we starved, and still we were told that our spirit would defeat their materialism. But you cannot fight with spirit alone. You cannot shoot spirit from a rifle or fill your stomach with spirit. Spirit does not stop you from dying of malnutrition in a foxhole while your enemy eats beef stew. The contrast became even starker as the Pacific War progressed. On islands like Bougainville, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers subsisted on tree bark, grass, and occasional handfuls of rice dropped by aircraft that increasingly never came. They developed beriberi, scurvy, and tropical diseases that their malnourished bodies could not fight. Meanwhile, American forces established elaborate supply networks that brought hot meals to frontline positions within hours. Navy ships provided refrigerated storage for fresh meat. Field bakeries produced fresh bread daily. Hospital ships offered full surgical facilities and post-operative meals that included steak, milk, and fruit. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. War is, at its core, a test of will and endurance. Soldiers on both sides endure fear, exhaustion, violence, and loss. But hunger adds another dimension of suffering, one that is constant, degrading, and impossible to ignore. A hungry soldier cannot think clearly. He cannot perform complex tasks. He becomes obsessed with food, dreaming about it, hallucinating about it, thinking about it every waking moment. His body begins to consume itself, breaking down muscle tissue for fuel, weakening bones, compromising immune function. Hunger does not just weaken the body, it destroys morale, erodes unit cohesion, and makes men question why they are fighting and for whom. Sound of boot steps in snow, labored breathing. Return to Klaus Hartmann, lying in the snow of the Ardennes forest in January 1945. He has been in combat for 3 years now. He has fought across Russia, retreated through Poland, and been sent west to participate in what Hitler called the last great offensive that would split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. The Battle of the Bulge, the propaganda called it, Germany's chance to prove that will and courage could still triumph over material superiority. But Klaus is so hungry he can barely hold his rifle. His unit's supply situation has completely collapsed. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, has been swept from the air by endless swarms of American fighters. The railroads that bring food and ammunition have been bombed into uselessness. The trucks that could carry supplies have no fuel. The horses that could pull wagons have been eaten. Klaus and his comrades receive 1 meal a day when they are lucky, watery soup with potato peelings and, if fortune smiles, a piece of gristly horse meat the size of a walnut. He has lost 40 pounds since 1942. His teeth are loose in his gums. His hair falls out in clumps. At night, he dreams not of home or loved ones but of food, roast chicken, butter, apples, bread with real wheat flour. He dreams of meals he ate as a child, before the war, before the hunger became his defining characteristic. And every day, he smells the Americans cooking. It drives him nearly mad. The wind carries it across the snow, bacon, coffee, cigarettes, chocolate. Sometimes, when the wind is right, he can smell fresh bread. The Americans have mobile bakeries. They have trucks refrigerated with ice. They have so much food that they feed some of it to local civilians, just to win their cooperation. They have so much food that Klaus once saw, through binoculars, an American soldier scraping half a plate of eggs into a garbage can. Half a plate of eggs. Thrown away. More protein than Klaus had eaten in a week, discarded like trash. On January 20th, Klaus's position is overrun by American forces. He is too weak to run. He sits in his foxhole with his hands raised, waiting to be shot or captured, barely caring which. An American soldier, a kid who looks about 19, well-fed and clean-shaven, approaches with his rifle ready. He looks at Klaus with something like pity. He offers Klaus a cigarette. A real cigarette, not the ersatz garbage the Wehrmacht issues. Klaus takes it with shaking hands and weeps. Within 6 hours, Klaus is behind American lines in a prisoner collection point. He expects to be interrogated, possibly beaten. Instead, he is given food. A metal tray. Beef stew with actual chunks of beef. Mashed potatoes with butter. Canned peaches. White bread. Real coffee with sugar. More food than he has seen in months, served on a tray to a captured enemy soldier who has spent years trying to kill Americans. Klaus eats slowly, afraid he will be sick if he rushes. Around him, other German prisoners do the same, many of them crying as they eat, overwhelmed by the simple animal pleasure of a full stomach and the bitter realization of what this food represents. One prisoner, a sergeant from Hamburg, says to Klaus, "They feed their prisoners better than our officers eat. How were we ever supposed to win?" This scene repeated itself across every theater of the war. American POW camps served meals that exceeded the rations many German soldiers had received even in peacetime. Red Cross inspectors who visited American-run camps noted that German prisoners often gained weight in captivity, their health improving dramatically on the American diet. Japanese prisoners, many of whom had been literally starving, experienced such dramatic physical improvement that some initially believed the food was poisoned or drugged. They could not conceive that their captors would feed them so well without ulterior motive. Sound of pen scratching on paper. Distant gramophone music. The archival evidence tells the story in stark numerical terms. United States military records document every aspect of the food supply chain with obsessive precision. In 1943 alone, the United States shipped to overseas theaters 485 million pounds of beef, 87 million pounds of pork, 400 million pounds of poultry, 180 million pounds of cheese, 500 million eggs, and 900 million pounds of flour. These numbers represent just military consumption, not including the vast quantities of food America continued to produce for its civilian population and for allied nations under Lend-Lease agreements. Compare this to German production figures from the same period. Germany, desperately short of agricultural land and resources, managed to produce approximately one-third the calories per capita that America did. And Germany's production was entirely dedicated to survival. There was nothing left over for stockpiling, nothing extra for comfort or morale, nothing wasted on luxuries like ice cream or fresh fruit flown to combat zones. Japanese production numbers tell an even grimmer story. By 1944, the Japanese home islands were experiencing serious food shortages. Civilians were placed on ration systems that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. The military took priority, but even soldiers stationed in Japan received increasingly inadequate rations. Soldiers deployed to Pacific Islands faced catastrophic shortages. Of the approximately 1.74 million Japanese military deaths in World War II, historians estimate that as many as 60% died not from combat but from starvation and malnutrition-related disease. 60%. Let that sink in. More Japanese soldiers died from hunger than from bullets, bombs, or bayonets. They died because their nation could not feed them while fighting a war against an enemy that could. The meat on the American soldier's plate, that steak, that roast chicken, that ham, became a symbol that transcended nutrition. It represented industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, logistical sophistication, and political will. It represented a nation that could fight a two-front war on opposite sides of the planet while simultaneously raising the standard of living for its civilian population. It represented everything that fascist ideology claimed was weakness but which proved, in practice, to be strength. Sound of typewriter keys. Radio static. Intelligence officers in every theater noted the psychological effect of food disparity in their interrogation reports. A declassified OSS document from 1944 states, captured German personnel consistently expressed shock and dismay at the quality and quantity of American rations. Many state that they had been told America was experiencing severe economic hardship and that American soldiers were poorly equipped. The discovery that American enlisted men eat better than German officers has a profoundly demoralizing effect. Prisoners frequently comment that if America can afford to feed its soldiers so well while fighting a global war, then Germany cannot possibly achieve victory. One German officer, a Major Wilhelm Scheidt, provided particularly eloquent testimony after his capture in France in August 1944. "I was a believer. I believed in the Führer, in our cause, in our inevitable triumph. I believed that will and discipline would overcome material disadvantage. Then I was captured and you gave me white bread with butter. Real butter. Not margarine, not ersatz spread, but actual butter made from cream. And meat. And coffee that was actually coffee. You gave this to me, an enemy prisoner, as if it were nothing. As if you had so much you could afford to be generous to those who wanted to destroy you. In that moment, I knew we had lost. Not because of tanks or planes or soldiers, but because we were fighting a nation that could turn abundance into a weapon. You defeated us with butter and steak and white bread. You showed us that everything we had been told was a lie." The Japanese experience produced similar testimonies, though often tinged with a different flavor of disillusionment. Lieutenant Hideo Takahashi, captured on Saipan in 1944, told his interrogators, "We were taught that suffering purified the spirit, that hardship made warriors strong, that Americans were weak because they loved comfort. But your Marines fought just as hard as any samurai, and they did it on full stomachs. They were stronger, faster, clearer in their thinking because they were well fed. Our advantage of spirit was overcome by your advantage of steak. It is humiliating to admit, but a well-fed enemy soldier will defeat a starving one no matter how pure his warrior spirit. This is a truth our commanders refused to accept, and tens of thousands died because of their refusal." Sound of wind, distant artillery, crows calling. There is a philosophical dimension to this story that reaches beyond mere logistics. The meat on the American plate represented the fundamental difference between democratic capitalism and fascist authoritarianism. Democratic societies are built on the premise that government exists to serve citizens, that prosperity should be broadly shared, that individuals have value beyond their utility to the state. The American military supply system reflected these values. It assumed that soldiers deserved to be well fed, that their comfort and morale mattered, that they were citizens in uniform rather than expendable tools of state power. Fascist ideology operated from opposite premises. Individual needs were subordinate to state demands. Sacrifice was virtue. Suffering built character. The state determined who received resources based on ideological worth, not human need. This philosophy produced military systems where officers ate adequately while enlisted men starved, where supplies were hoarded for political favorites while frontline troops went without, where propaganda about spiritual superiority substituted for actual food. The collision of these systems produced predictable results. Hungry soldiers lose battles. Starving armies collapse. Nations that cannot feed their military cannot sustain wars of aggression across multiple continents. The abundance that German and Japanese soldiers encountered when they met Americans was not an accident or a lucky coincidence. It was the inevitable product of systems that valued human welfare and possessed the industrial and agricultural capacity to provide it. Consider the symbolism embedded in something as simple as a K-ration. This compact cardboard box, designed to fit in a soldier's pocket, contained enough food to sustain him for a day: canned meat, biscuits, candy, fruit, coffee, cigarettes, matches, and chewing gum. The entire package weighed just over 2 pounds. American factories produced approximately 105 million K-rations during the war, each one a small miracle of industrial design, nutritional science, and logistical planning. Now imagine you are a German soldier who has been eating black bread and turnip soup for weeks. You overrun an American position and find crates of K-rations. You open one and discover it contains not just food but variety. Different meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all designed to provide balanced nutrition and maintain morale. You find candy. You find cigarettes. You find chewing gum, which serves no nutritional purpose whatsoever, but which Americans include anyway because it helps with stress and dry mouth and provides a small moment of normalcy in abnormal circumstances. That chewing gum, useless, frivolous, wasteful chewing gum, tells you everything you need to know about the relative strength of your nation versus your enemies. Your nation cannot provide you with adequate bread. Your enemy's nation provides its soldiers with luxury items that serve no survival function. You have been told you are winning. The chewing gum tells you that you are losing. Sound of waves, seagulls, distant ship horns. By 1945, the disparity had become absolute. Germany was starving. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had devastated German agriculture and food distribution. Cities were rubble. Rail networks had collapsed. Millions of refugees streamed west, fleeing the Soviet advance, consuming what little food remained. German soldiers in the field were told to live off the land, which meant stealing from occupied populations who had nothing left to steal. Units surrendered en masse not because of military defeat, but because they were literally starving to death. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers trapped on bypassed islands resorted to cannibalism. This is not propaganda or exaggeration, it is documented historical fact, attested to by Japanese survivors and forensic evidence. On islands like New Guinea and the Philippines, Japanese garrisons cut off from resupply ate their dead, then ate prisoners, then turned on each other. Officers executed and ate their own men. The Yamato spirit, the Bushido code, the samurai honor, all of it dissolved in the face of hunger that transcended morality and reduced men to animals. Meanwhile, American soldiers continued to eat 3 meals a day. Navy cooks roasted turkeys for Thanksgiving. Army field kitchens baked cakes for birthdays. The USO brought Bob Hope and Marlene Dietrich to perform for troops, serving donuts and coffee to audiences of soldiers who could afford to relax, to laugh, to think about something other than their next meal. The food was not just nutrition. It was psychological warfare conducted at the most basic level of human need. It was proof of concept for democratic capitalism's ability to project power and sustain logistics across global distances. It was a daily reminder to every American soldier that his nation valued him enough to feed him well, and a daily revelation to every Axis soldier who encountered that abundance that he had been lied to about everything. Sound of boots on pavement, distant celebrating. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Klaus Hartmann sits in a POW camp in France, awaiting processing and repatriation. He has gained 20 pounds in the 3.5 months since his capture. His teeth have stopped hurting. His hair has started growing back. He eats 3 meals a day from American kitchens and still cannot quite believe it is real. He thinks often about the war, about the lies he was told, about the friends who died believing those lies. He thinks about the officer in Munich who promised him that Americans were soft and weak and easily defeated. He wonders if that officer ever met an American soldier, ever saw an American supply depot, ever confronted the reality that an industrial democracy at war is a force more terrible than any fascist fantasy of warrior purity. He thinks about meat. The smell of it, the taste of it, the simple animal satisfaction of eating enough. He thinks about how many of his comrades died hungry, how many could have been saved if Germany's leaders had chosen to feed their people instead of conquering their neighbors, how many lives were wasted in service of an ideology that valued symbols over sustenance. The Americans will send him home soon, back to a Germany that no longer exists, a Germany destroyed by the very forces it unleashed. He will carry with him memories of combat and camaraderie and terror and loss. But he will also carry the memory of that first meal after capture, beef stew and mashed potatoes and white bread, and the bitter knowledge that wars are not won by propaganda or willpower or racial superiority. They are won by nations that can feed their soldiers meat 3 times a day. Sound of wind, silence, a single church bell. There is an epilogue to write, a reflection to offer on what this story means beyond the immediate history. The meat on the American soldier's plate was never just meat. It was the physical manifestation of an idea, that prosperity and liberty are intertwined, that free people produce abundant societies, that democracies which value individual dignity will ultimately defeat authoritarian systems that treat humans as expendable resources. The fascist powers went to war believing that discipline and sacrifice and warrior spirit would triumph over democratic softness. They believed that hardship strengthened while comfort weakened. They believed that a people willing to endure suffering would defeat a people who loved ease. They staked their futures on these beliefs, and they were catastrophically wrong. The abundance that shocked German and Japanese soldiers was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength they could not match. It was the product of free markets and technological innovation and agricultural science and political systems that rewarded productivity rather than punishing initiative. It was the result of a society that said, "Our soldiers deserve to be well fed, and we have the means to make it so, and we will dedicate those means to that purpose because we value the lives and welfare of our citizens." This is not triumphalism. It is historical observation. The numbers do not lie. The testimonies cannot be dismissed. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. America's ability to project force while maintaining abundance, to fight a global war while raising living standards at home, to feed its military better than its enemies fed their civilians, to include ice cream and chewing gum and fresh fruit in frontline supply chains, represented a systemic superiority that ideology alone could never overcome. The German soldier who smelled bacon frying and realized his nation had been lying to him, the Japanese soldier who watched Americans throw away food that would have saved his starving comrades, the prisoners who gained weight in captivity while their former brothers-in-arms starved in the field, all of them confronted a truth that shattered the propaganda they had been fed, that the war was already decided, not by courage or tactics or operational brilliance, but by the simple fact that one side could eat and the other could not. In the end, all the Lebensraum and Greater East Asia co-prosperity and master race mythology came down to this: an American soldier sitting in a foxhole, eating beef stew from a can, smoking a Real cigarette, drinking actual coffee, while across the frozen ground or steaming jungle or desert sand, his enemies slowly starved and wondered why he was fighting and what his leaders had promised him that turned out to be nothing but lies wrapped in flags and anthems. The meat was the message. The abundance was the answer. And the lesson, written in the graveyard of fascist dreams, was this: you cannot conquer the world if you cannot feed your army, and you cannot feed your army if your ideology values symbols over substance, sacrifice over prosperity, domination over dignity. 3 meals a day. Meat at each one. Enough to share with prisoners. Enough to waste. Enough to make your enemy understand, in his empty belly and weakening body, that he has already lost and was always going to lose, because the nation that can turn food into a weapon of psychological warfare is a nation that has already won the only war that truly matters: the war of production, organization, and human value. Fade to silence. This is what they never told Klaus Hartmann in that Munich recruitment hall in 1941. This is what the propaganda hid and the ideology denied, and the officers did not understand until it was too late. The Americans were not soft. They were fed. And in the arithmetic of total war, that made all the difference. End.